1963.
Finally, we arrived at the White House, and we had a prayer session. And then Jackie said, "Why don't you spend the night here at the White House? This has been a tough day for you." I had never spent the night in the White House. So I went upstairs, and there was Larry O'Brien, Ken O'Donnell. We talked till about 5 o'clock in the morning. Finally, I went to sleep. And suddenly, at 7 o'clock, the phone next to me rings, and the secretary is saying, "The president wants to talk to you." And the first thing that comes into my brain, "Oh my God, I've just had a terrible nightmare." And then I hear this voice saying, "Oh, Pierre, this is Lyndon." And I suddenly knew for sure that JFK was dead.
At the United States Embassy in London, on the morning of November the 23rd, a steady stream of visitors come to pay their respects. A stream that feeds a river of mourning worldwide.
In the period immediately after President Kennedy's death, Mrs. Kennedy received over 3 million expressions of sympathy and condolence from people around the country and around the world. These were in the form of letters, of spiritual bouquets and mass cards, and those, a very substantial number, came from Britain, which was one of the countries which produced the largest spontaneous response to President Kennedy's death. Mrs. Kennedy received approximately 500,000 letters from people in the United Kingdom. A lady from London wrote, "Dear Mrs. Kennedy, I hesitated writing it once, as of course you will be inundated with messages, and anyway, there are no words at all. I am still wondering if I shall wake up and find that it was a bad dream. It's so impossible to believe."
Well, when I got a quiet moment, I thought I must write to that poor girl. Let her know that the whole world is looking and watching to hear some, at least small comfort for her. She had to have the love of everybody. It was only that was going to pull her through. You can have all the money in the world. They were a wealthy family. But you still need people. It's the feeling of others and the letting of you know that those people are there feeling for you. That's what brings you through these things.
Dear Mrs. Kennedy, I am writing on behalf of the staff and pupils of St. Augustine's Secondary School on the tragic and untimely death of your husband, President J.F. Kennedy. We have followed with great excitement his fresh, youthful and wise approach.
Your dear husband will surely go down in history as the greatest man of our time. His steady toils for peace, his wonderful stand over Cuba, and above all, his Civil Rights Bill. Indeed, we have lost a good friend. He will long be remembered with love and respect.
Merseyside showed its respect in its own way. At Everton's ground, as at others on the day after Kennedy's death, a minute's silence before the game.
I think a lot of people were so horrified by what had happened that they were glad to be able to take part in some form of tribute. And I was over there in the Bullens Road stand, and the silence started, and it was almost, well, it was absolute. I couldn't even hear the traffic outside.
I've been watching Everton since I was about 8 years of age. I remember that day when they had the minute silence, a minute or 2 minutes silence. There wasn't a sound anyway. The bus was behind, couldn't hear a thing, and you know, it was just total silence. And next thing, this bloke jumps up, punches the air, shouts, "Long live Khrushchev." Next minute, it seemed to go in slow motion. Bloke hit him the back of the neck. He seemed to go down in slow motion. You know? And they were punching him, pushing each other away to punch him. And then they seemed to make a pathway for the policeman come along there, and the policeman, he just jumped over and lifted him over that wall there. I don't know, it's just a funny thing. It's just one of those things where it sticks in your mind, it just sticks in your mind.
That That was the week that was. For many viewers, the unmissable weekend show. Irreverent, provocative, funny. Its producer knew that this edition called for something else.
We were not doing a judgment on Kennedy. We were trying to reflect what immediately was the national feeling, and indeed it turned out, though we couldn't know that at the time, the international feeling that a light had gone out. When a light has gone out, you don't do an investigative report on the quality of the fuel.
A young man rode with his head held high under the Texas sun.
Ned stood me almost in silhouette. There's very little of me that shows, because I said, if I start to cry, I don't want that on the screen because I don't think it looks right.
Lord, he so goes riding on.
I always remember seeing that little tear, one tear coming down one side of the face, which I suppose symbolised the shock that most people felt at the time.
I thought it was. I'm very proud of that piece of music. I thought they did a wonderful job, and it was. I wish I didn't have to have sung it, but it was wonderful to do it.
At BOAC, some senior flight personnel were contacted urgently.
So I gave operations a ring, and I was told that I had to go out on a trip the following day. When I asked where to, they said, sorry, can't tell you. Well, where am I going? Sorry, can't tell you. Well, how long am I going away for? I can't tell you. Well, you try telling a wife that you're going away, you don't know where to and how long for. It's not an easy question, but she was very understanding. Following day, I arrived at the airport and I met the flight manager, who then informed me the circumstances. That we were to take the Duke of Edinburgh, the Prime Minister, Sir Alec Douglas-Home, plus certain high officials from the Foreign Office over to Washington for the funeral of President Kennedy. It could be described best as tense, because having lost one of the world's great leaders, I think it affected everybody. And obviously governments were wondering what was going to happen in the light of the assassination.
Royalty, heads of state, many of them much older than the murdered president, and thousands of ordinary mourners converged on Washington. John Kennedy had had just over 1,000 days to make his mark on history.
He made the American people feel responsible for the disadvantaged, the poor, the blacks, the people who were regarded as problem people in the previous system, but he made them feel that the American people were responsible for those who weren't as well off as they were.
As the first bitter pangs of our incredulous grief begins to pass, we must thank God that we were privileged, however briefly, to have had this great man for our president, for he has now taken his place among the great figures of world history.
Mrs. Kennedy asked me to send some pipers up to play the cortege from the White House to the cathedral.
It had been just 12 days since the Black Watch played on the White House lawn.
She knew that JFK had enjoyed the performance so much, and the children, that she would wish some recognition of that occasion at the funeral.
Family life plays a big part in everybody's life at some stage. It has to. And their time was then. I wonder how she felt inside. She must have been all torn apart.
John F. Kennedy seemed young, he looked good, he did the right things, he seemed to say the right things, he had a beautiful looking wife. And I think that's what the shock was. He was so young, and you felt he was one of the gang, really. Then suddenly he was taken away. And I think that's why I was in sort of shock. He was such a young lad.